Welcome back to another episode of Eerie Excursions, the podcast that takes the road less travelled and a left turn into the shadows with me, Amy, a history nerd who loves a good ghost story. Now, I'm no expert, so along our eerie adventure, we'll meet local guides who know all about the spooky legends lurking in their back garden. And watch out, because we might just be down the road from where you are right now. So for today's trip, we're back in the northwest of England, in the city of Lancaster.
In this corner, if you think about the numbers of people that were hung, it's very hard to know a specific number, but it's in the hundreds. And right here, their souls left this earth. So if you ever come up at the dead of night, there really is a particular strange atmosphere. If you stand just listening to the wind in the trees that surround the castle, there's like there's an energy to this area.
You ready to delve into the darkness? Before we hear more about Lancaster, let's meet our guide, Peter.
So my name is Peter McGarry. So for the last 8 years, we ran the escape rooms in Lancaster. And one of the rooms is based around the Pendle Witches. And from that, I've always had a bit of a fascination with the sort of the darker side of Lancaster and its history. And having lived in places like York, where they really sort of promote their history and everything that goes on, particularly spooky aspects, we really wanted to sort of set up and sell that in Lancaster. So yeah, it was about 3 years ago we set up the Lancaster Ghost Watch, of which we've been doing on a regular basis since then. And it's a 90-minute tour around the historical city of Lancaster that delves into sort of some grisly murders, some spooky locations, some haunted houses, and culminating at the castle, where we'll talk about the Pendle Witches and about why Lancaster had its name, the Hanging Town.
We'll come back to why Lancaster is known as the Hanging Town a little bit later, as there's so much history to this small city nestled in Lancashire's hills.
So just a very brief snippet of history. So Lancaster was actually sort of a Roman fort. It was sort of created to try and be a strong point in the north to sort of hold off those pesky northern invaders that kept coming down and picketing. And so it started off as a fort which we now know as the castle, which was a wooden structure, and over time that was developed. So when William the Conqueror came, 1066, his cousin, Roger Poitou, decided to reinforce it and built it, sort of developed it from the wooden fort that it was into using stone and making it a little bit stronger. And that was really the foundation of the town. It was only a city then in the 1930s when it got its city status in 1937. And history-wise, it's probably most well known for the War of the Roses, in the House of Lancaster. The actual sort of royalty wasn't based in Lancaster at the time, but obviously they fought under the Red Rose of Lancaster, which we did win. Didn't want to point out too, obviously. But mainly it's been known as sort of its industry, particularly the last 200 years, particularly around the sugar trade. It used to be quite a really big port town, which we will sort of bypass on the tour. And it had quite a big connection with the sort of sugar plantains. Again, a bit of a mixed history with sort of the slavery links, particularly around a lot of the statues and buildings bought in Lancaster. Another thing it's really famous for is for its furniture, Gillows furniture, which was exported all the way around the world, particularly to India. And it's really famous for sort of its iconic furniture look.
For our first story, Peter takes me to Dalton Square near the town hall. Now, it's important to note that all the stories in this episode are quite graphic, so if you love your eerie stories without gore, you may want to skip this trip.
So this is where we start the tour as well. So we stood right outside the door of number 2 Dalton Square. It's a brilliant place for a tour start anyway. We're in the nice Dalton Square of Lancaster. We're stood directly opposite the town hall. In between the town hall and us stands the statue of Queen Victoria. And the reason why we particularly picked this location is because of the crimes that developed inside the house. So it's a really good focal point for the tour because you can literally see the door where the doctor unfortunately brought out body parts bit by bit and put them into the back of the car. Our story will start in 1935. That's when, unfortunately, the foul deed took place. And the doctor in question is Dr. Buck Ruxton. Now, he was actually born into wealth and privilege in India. He was born in Mumbai before studying medicine in London. He went back and forth to home. He ran away from a wife and left her in India, but we'll sort of bypass all that. He wound up in Edinburgh because he wanted to become a surgeon. And at that time, Edinburgh was the place to be for both surgery and also for forensics, and that'll link in later quite nicely. And while he was there, he became quite fascinated with a lady that works in a cafe there. Her name is Isabel Kerr. He wooed her over a period of time. Isabel was quite a strong, independent lady. She once married a Dutch sailor a couple of days after they met, and unfortunately a couple of days after that he left her again and went home to to Holland. So she was quite a strong, independent woman who sort of stuck to her guns, and over time he sort of wooed her and they became an item. We'll fast forward to their move to Lancaster. Eventually they became a couple, and having failed as a surgeon, this premises here, number 2 Dalton Square, became up for sale. So it's a big old Victorian premises, really high ceilings, spread over 3 floors. At the time, it was really decadently arranged by Buck Ruxton. And the reason why they bought it was because he could practice medicine downstairs, and above was the living quarters. So they had 2 floors to live. And they quickly became a family of 5. So we had 2 daughters and a son. And this is where they stayed. Now, we'll cut to the date. Okay, so we're on the 15th of September now. And inside the house is just Buck. Okay, now he's there with the housemaid at the time, Mary Jane Rogerson, and his 3 children. Now, Mary was a living housemaid, so she would live in there 6 days a week, and on the 7th she'd go home to see the family. So we're now at very late Saturday night coming into Sunday morning. Bit of a backstory, Buck was always obsessed with Isabella having affairs. Okay, he would constantly accuse her of seeing other men, and they had a bit of a tempestuous relationship. Okay, he would often abuse her physically, verbally, hold her at knife point and make her sort of crawl up and down the stairs until he felt that she'd completely been forgiven. She often would actually pack up her stuff and take the children and say, no, I'm going back to my family in Edinburgh. However, sadly, she kept returning back. So their relationship wasn't the greatest. He was very controlling, very jealous. And on the night of the 15th of September, Isabella had been out with her sister and a friend to Blackpool Illuminations. They'd been off having a nice evening. However, Buck had been stuck at home. And in his head, he must have been worried, jealous, thinking that she was out yet again having an affair. So unfortunately, in she gets late in the morning, and Buck is waiting. Now we know, unfortunately, before she even reached to the top of the stairs, an argument ensued, and she was dead before she reached the landing. His strong surgical hands wrapping around her neck, draining the life from her body. Now, poor Mary, who was the housemaid at the time, was upstairs, obviously heard the disturbance and thought, oh no, another quarrel, let's go and see what happened. And out she came. Sadly, Buck, obviously wanting to get away with the crime, couldn't leave a witness. So we know through the autopsy on her body that she died from blunt force trauma to the head. So now he has 2 bodies on his hands. And what does he do? Well, he's a surgeon, he's a very clever man. He tries to get rid of the bodies by doing everything you would think a very clever surgeon would do. He decides to slice them up. So these murders became known as the jigsaw murders because of the fact that the bodies became like a jigsaw beaten back together. They were cut into 46 individual parts. But what he also did, because he was a smart man, is he removed anatomical features that would indicate who they were. So for instance, Isabella had a bit of a crooked nose, so off that was sliced. He burnt fingertips, pulled out eyeballs, removed teeth, singed any hair on the face, and chopped them up in his bathtub, which you can now view at the Lancaster Castle Police Museum, into small chunks. Wrapped them up in various different things around the house, curtains, clothes, bags. Hired a car. He was, again, sensible enough to not put them in his own car. And then the next day, with his son in the car with him, drove all the way up to a bridge in Scotland, into a little town called Moffat, and threw them into a river. Off they went to sea, or so he hoped. Down he came, reported them as missing, said that they'd, a few different stories, that they'd gone off to Edinburgh together, that they'd run off together, that Mary was having a baby, so they'd ran off to get it aborted somewhere. and sat back with his feet up, hoping it would all blow over. However, fortunately for him, things began to unravel quite quickly. So his first mistake was having thrown them into a river. He'd gone to Scotland. And Scotland, at the time, was sort of the height of forensic medicine as well as surgery. And because he thought it was a river, but it wasn't, it was a bit of a tributary, they didn't get very far and they washed up. Because there'd been heavy rainfall, he thought they'd just float out to the sea and be gone forever. Now, poor dog walker, a few days later, he's staying at the hotel nearby, as walking down in the morning and saw bags from the top of the bridge. Oh, they look a bit peculiar, let's have a closer look. And started to identify body parts washed up. So she informed the local police officers, who then came and collected these body parts. And as I said, over time, it turned into 46 body parts. He also, as he was driving back down from Scotland, fortunately, hit a cyclist who very smartly rang the police in Pendle, much further down, and said, "I've just been knocked over by a car. Can you please stop it on its way down?" So they had him fleeing from the scene. Now, as they began to put these body parts back together, they were wrapped in various different garments. However, the police were very clever to know that one of them was a newspaper. Some of the sort of articles had been wrapped in newspaper, and it was a national print. It was a Sunday Graphic. But when they looked very closely, they noticed that part of it was sort of a slip-in edition. So it was like advertising your local activity. And at the time, part of this slip-in was advertising a carnival in Morecambe, of which there was only about 2,500 copies ever printed to about 30 or 40 distributors. And would you believe it? Whose name was on one of those copies that got delivered?
His actual
name
Oh, no.
on the delivery copy. Oh, so things started to piece together. And what's fascinating is what actually happened following this is this sort of kicked the wave for real development of forensic medicine. Because it wasn't just a case of a body was found, it was linked to a missing persons report. They had to be pieced back together bit by bit. And they contacted the local universities in Glasgow and Edinburgh, who were absolutely enthralled to become involved in this case. So they 3D printed images of the bodies, essentially, and laid them down on top of these body parts, particularly when it came to the skulls. So they did the first, essentially, 3D X-ray of a skull on top of an image of the two women's faces, and it matched up perfectly. They even looked at fingerprints. So the detective in charge, who was a fingerprint expert at the time working up in Glasgow, actually singed off his own fingers and then proved that even following that, he could identify the corresponding fingerprints. So they were able to identify the fingerprints linked from the two ladies, even though they'd been removed. They looked at the maggots that were in the bodies that corresponded exactly to the day that the women were reported missing, and all that linked in with the fact that the two women matched up with two missing women that were linked to the area with the newspaper, all tied it down to this region. Now, when the police came and searched the premises, they found blood pooled underneath the floorboards. Even though he'd ripped out the carpets, got decorators in, there was still plenty of blood left in the crime scene, particularly when it came to the bathtub and things left in the drain.
So the bathtub that's in the museum, is it still clean?
It has been cleaned. No. And a quite interesting story is one of the chaps who was, so the bathtub's been moved to various locations, and it was once kept just in the cellar in one of the very old police stations, which is now not longer a police station. And when that was being renovated, this decorator actually kept the bathtub in his garden at home, and his children were playing in it in the summer. No. So it's been well cleaned and used since then. But yeah, if you want to see the bathtub, you can go in and visit it. So fortunately, all that came together, and he was charged with murder. And quite swiftly, actually, the next year he was found guilty. And considering the crime was in September, on May the 12th, 1936, so not even 12 months later, he was hanged in Manchester, which is a great outcome for all. He obviously maintained his innocence throughout it all. However, he did write a letter to the journalist covering the case at the News of the World at the time, only to be read after he was dead, which did then say that he was guilty. He committed the murder. So even after all of that, he couldn't even come clean. Yeah. It was only in death that he told the truth.
Yeah. So what is this residence now? Is it do people live here?
Yeah, council owns, yeah. So the actual GP practice is now at the other end of the square.
That's very ironic.
So yeah, so luckily you don't see the same GP rooms. But yeah, no, it's just a council property now, so it's office space, etc. And there was quite an interesting. So this was one of the most publicised stories in all of the 1930s. So much so that first we got bells ringing for us in the background, which is very nice of them. And the children in the area and nationally used to sing a song about this case. It was Dr. Buck Ruxton, you murdered your wife. Red stains on your carpet, red stains on your knife. The housemaid saw you and threatened to tell, oh, Dr. Ruxton, you killed her as well.
I did warn you about the gore, and we're not done yet, so we head out of Dalton Square, across the road and through Francis Passage, interestingly enough spelt with 2 F's, past the shopping centre and up the hill towards Lancaster's castle, specifically the back of the castle.
As we can see before us, with the sort of double doors that we can see that are about sort of 6-7 foot from the floor, this is Hanging Corner. Okay, and the reason why it's called that is because Lancaster was known as the Hanging Town. It didn't become a city until 1937, and outside of London, as I just said, it hung more people than anywhere else in the country. So it really had a fascination with making people not leave alive. Okay. So we're going to take a little sneak peek as to what that would have been like, okay? Because it was a bit of a grisly tale anyway. So prior to the 1800s, people would have been taken out to Ashton Moor. And if you've not visited Lancaster, there's a huge building. It's actually what we think is the second biggest mausoleum in the world outside the Taj Mahal. It's called Ashton Memorial and it stands upon the Ashton Moor. It was built by Lord Ashton and he gave that building and its grounds to the people of Lancaster. So it's a fantastic place to go and it's got lots of parts around it. But that was where the executions used to take place. Following that, for keeping it close to the castle, A, for security purposes, and B, to put on more of a spectacle, they held it here. So if you would imagine scaffolding built up for the gallows, up to maybe about sort of 7-8 foot in height. Over here, as we look out, we can just see the wall then. Below that is the River Loon. And none of this would have been built up. So you would have had up to 4,000-5,000 people come to sit on the banks, including organised school trips, I add, for a day out to come and see a hanging. Okay, so never mind Britain's Got Talent, get them to a hanging. That's what we should bring back. So then you've got thousands of people, some emotional because it's people they know, mostly people very excited to see people executed. And then it starts to get a little bit quieter because the doors open. And just out through those doors there, the damned are brought out. Led one by one, ropes tying their hands behind them, and the hangman leading them to their place. Okay. Now, there's various ways to hang people. There's the short drop and the long drop. So the long drop is essentially the kind of way to kill people. It's very simple. You fall a longer way. That means there's a high chance that the neck will snap by the rope. Okay, so you'll be killed quicker. It also means that the force to the neck would really take the air out of your throat, so you'd die pretty quickly. The short drop meant essentially you dropped about 6 inches. The floor just fell away, so you would die quite a horrible death by slowly suffocating to death. Lancaster obviously favoured the short drop, okay, because it wanted to put on a spectacle. So the accused are brought out, the noose is put around the neck, and the invigilator will say a few words. So at this moment in time, the crowd are silent. The damned will get their last chance to speak. It could be, and I love you, I didn't do it. They might swear, it could be anything. And then the frenzy starts. People start throwing things. Loved ones start crying. The hangman walks underneath the gallows and pulls the lever, which removes the pin. And the accused fall down. The noose just slowly tightens around their neck, and you see their eyes start to bulge. Gasping for breath, obviously unable to do anything. Some actually bit off their own tongue because their body would go into spasm, which in a way is good because they just drown on a pool of their own blood. Others wouldn't be so lucky, and you might have family members jumping over the boarding that was at the front, pulling down on their legs, trying to kill them quicker. Yeah. And at this point, you've got 4,000 or 5,000 people just going wild at the sight of these unfortunate souls losing their death here. And again, in this corner, if you think about the numbers of people that were hung, it's very hard to know a specific number, but it's in the hundreds. And right here, their souls left this earth. So if you ever come up at the dead of night, there really is a particular strange atmosphere. If you stand just listening to the wind in the trees that surround the castle, there's like there's an energy to this area, which is no great surprise. It's one of the most bloodied spots in definitely all of the northwest, if not one in England, because it's such a small location that so many people have left this world.
Yeah, and you can't hear anything,
even
with the cars, everything.
Yeah, it's a very secluded spot, and it is, again, when you look around, apart from the fact that maybe the fortifications have been built up, you look around and you've got the priory, which would have been here, looking exactly the same 200 years ago. The castle wouldn't have changed a bit. And apart from maybe a few newer lamps and lights, it's just like taking a bit of a trip back in time. So yeah, it's a fascinating place to be.
How many people would be at one time on the scaffold?
So again, it depends on how many sort of people. There was definitely more when it was over in Ashton Moor. So for instance, all of the Pendle Witches were hung in one sitting, and there was 10 of them. I think it's probably up to about 8 at one time, but they would have multiple sittings where sometimes people would be hung, the bodies removed, and then others would be hung again.
And were any, I think I'm just thinking of like things like Pirates of the Caribbean where like people were left to hang as like a warning. Was it any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So particularly it came to religion, depending on who was in charge of the country, will dictate how severe punishments were. So when it came to religion and religious preaching, anything to do with treason, often, well, the bodies wouldn't be left to be hung, but what they would be doing is removed, chopped up, and placed on spikes around the castle as a warning. There was one particular incident with a friar who down in Bamber Bridge, which is just slightly south of here, was arrested for the crime of saying mass. Silly man. He was brought up. They said to him, "Listen, if you recant your faith and say no, I will listen to the king's word. We'll let you go." He obviously said no. So they brought him up, hung him. Luckily, the rope snapped. He said, they said to him, "Will you recant your faith? This is surely a warning from God." And he said, "If you've actually seen what I have just seen, then you would not be scared."
Wow.
So up he went, hung him again. But they didn't kill him. They waited until he was nearly dead, brought him down, took him inside, put him on the rack, stretched him, again, not till he died, took a very sharp pointed blade in just below the sternum, right the way down to his navel. Wasn't dead yet. They started to pull out his insides, not dead yet. Holding it up to his face, they then set it on fire. So he died with the smell of his own insides burning just inside him.
And for our final story, we head to the front of the castle.
If you walk down to the walls just on the right, as you sort of head around, you can view the river, Loon, view sort of the scenery then as it sort of turns into countryside and the surrounding areas.
Where Peter tells us about one of Britain's most famous witch trials, the Pendle Witches.
Super. So we're standing outside the front of the castle now, which has a beautiful look over essentially a bit of a history of Lancaster in terms of sort of the different buildings that are poking out. You can see the cathedral there with its spire just sort of jutting out in the distance. And I don't think you can see Ashton Memorial from here, but at various points you can see sort of the sort of dome on top of the memorial. But yeah, witches. So our story now goes back to the 1600s, focusing or culminating in the year 1612. But just a bit of a backstory that those who maybe aren't too familiar with what was going on in the country at that time. So on the throne was King James I, who was formerly King of Scotland. I think he was king when he was about 13 months old, and then when Elizabeth died, he became King of England. Now he, from a religious point of view, he was raised a Catholic by his mother, but there was very Protestant overview in the country. Okay, so it was very mixed when it came to sort of religious dialogue at the time. He actually, as kings go, was quite sympathetic to different religions. He wasn't too dogmatic like Henry VIII was about you must preach God is king. He did believe that that the king was sort of God's messenger on earth, but he was far more lenient with Catholics. However, what he did have a particularly almost like a focus on was witches in Scotland. So he believed that witches or people within the occult were trying to kill him, and he believed that from a very young age. He was eventually married to a lady from Denmark, Queen Anne. And when it was her time to come over and meet the king to get married, there was bad storms, which meant that after 3 attempts she couldn't make it. And he blamed witches on the fact that they were preventing her and trying to kill her. So he went over to her, and quite a sort of scary journey. Eventually got there, spent some time, and even on the journey back then from Denmark, it was very, very wavy and not a pleasant voyage. So he had this sort of almost fascination with witches and the occult, and he wrote a book called Demonology, essentially proclaiming that there was sects, S-E-C-T, not the other sex, of witches, particularly focused around the north of England and Scotland, and they were to be rounded up, and if identified as a witch, put to trial. Not to be tortured, they were to be put to trial in the way that people should be in law, and if proven guilty, be put to death. And that sort of brings about sort of where we were at when it came to the year 1612, because then different people around the country wanted to curry favour with the king. And the magistrate in Lancaster was a chap called Roger Nowell, and he wanted to make a bit of a name for himself. So any opportunity he could to prove to the king that he was listening and doing right by him by removing witches from society, he would jump at. So everything sort of took a turn in 1612, and we're going to pick up the story in Pendle, which is a very small town outside of Lancaster. It's in Lancashire itself, but it's a little bit south and a little bit more inland. And in that area, there was two almost not rival families, you would say. Two families that have been practicing witchcraft for many years. Now, in the 17th century, witchcraft was well known and almost tolerated to a certain degree, because you could have almost good witches or bad witches. Good witches were those that we would know as sort of healers, that would maybe make potions to make you better, maybe tell your fortunes, give you herbal medicine for various different ailments. And then you had sort of the more negative side of witchcraft, the hexes, the spells, I'll curse your family if you don't do as I say. And these sort of two families had a little bit of animosity over the years. There'd been accusations that one family had murdered another family's sheep, that one member of one family was under the protection of the other family, and if they didn't pay them 8 guineas a year or whatever it was, then they would put a spell on their family. So we had Elizabeth Southerns, which was the matriarch of one family, the Southerns, and she was known as Old Demdike, and we had Anne Whittle, the Whittles, who was the matriarch of the other. They were both widowed, both in and around 80 years old, and they sort of were the heads of two families. Now, what came to pass was the granddaughter of Elizabeth Southerns, Alison Device, was out one day peddling, and witches of the time, or people that maybe practiced witchcraft, would have something called a familiar with them. Now, those that aren't familiar with that term, it might be a dog, a cat, a bird, or whatever. But Alison's was a little black dog that she had with her. And there was a man called John Law who was making his way down the road, and she was trying to. He was a travelling man, and she was trying to buy pins from him. Now, a bit of an argument ensued. Whatever happened, he, what we would say now, had a stroke. Okay, so he collapsed, unable to talk, unable to walk. So this young girl was a little bit shocked. She'd obviously said some heated words to him, and this is where sort of sliding doors moments came in, because if she'd have left him for dead, when he would have died, because he did eventually, nothing would have happened. But she actually tried to help him, and she took him to a local inn and said, "Listen, I've had a bit of an argument. He's fallen down. I said some harsh things to him. Can you please help him? He needs to see someone. He was just about aware enough that when his brother came to say, she put a curse on me. As we were arguing, she put a curse on me and I dropped down and now I can't talk. And it essentially stemmed from there. So this eventually made its way back to Roger Nowell, who thought, right, that's definitely witchy behaviour. Let's get her in. And then accusations came between families. Because, yes, one witch was good, but Roger Nowell really wanted to make an impression. So he was aware that there was more than one witch practicing witchcraft. So he got this young girl in on her own, kept in the most foul of conditions, and got a chap called Thomas Cavell, who was the jailer at the time, who lived at Judge's Lodgings, which is a very lovely building down at the bottom of the hill there, to come and interrogate her. And again, we said they can't use torture, but they could use many forms that we would classify as torture nowadays.
Sorry, so Anne was taken here to the...
Alison, yeah. So Alison, yeah, she was taken into the castle for questioning. And eventually other names were brought up. Well, she from that family said this, and she's previously killed my cow. Well, then they brought in a member of the other family. Well, no, that's not true, because although I've done that, or may have done that, well, they have put a curse on him, so he's under that. And eventually it came to be that the majority of both the families were brought in and held at the castle. So there was 11 taken to court, and whilst they were waiting, unfortunately, one of the witches, Elizabeth Southern, who was the head of the Southern family, she died whilst in captivity visit, so she didn't actually make it to court. And they were kept in a way, so they believed that witches used spells through their hands. So the way that they were contained within the castle is they were all fastened to a big stone sort of wheel, and their hands were fixed to their body, sort of a cross pinned, so they were unable to raise their hands up. Obviously, they were kept in these most foul, unsanitary conditions for days and days and days.
So they were literally just kept like that?
Kept like that. Oh. So that, well, whenever anyone was around that they could use spells on, they were fed very, very little, given very little water. They were obviously beaten, spoken out of terms. And then when it came to the trials, having said all of these under interrogation, then it was all brought up in trial. And unfortunately, the 9 out of the 10 and plus the 11 Elizabeth Southerns were found guilty. There was one that was found not guilty, but the others were all taken out and executed over an Ashton Moor. And the reason why we know about this is one man who was involved in the trial, a local magistrate who was just a junior clerk at the time, was told to write down every little bit of information that happened. So actually the detailing of this case is relatively thorough, but there's no other writing you'll find. So whatever was written in that court case is what we know occurred. So what we do know is obviously 9 died at the gallows, 1 died, and Elizabeth Southern, who was the matriarch of the Southern family, has said to have put a curse on the men of Lancaster, or any man born within Lancaster city, that they will always die within the city. So if ever they leave, bad luck will befall them and they will return home. And that curse is still said to be prevalent to this day.
Men of Lancaster everywhere.
Yeah, and having known, I've not been born here, but having known quite a few people born in Lancaster, none of them ever leave. Absolutely, they're always still here or work their way back here. So there must be something said about that curse.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And just a quick one about the 11. You say 11 people, but I'm assuming that there were 11 women.
No. There were some men in there. Yeah. So there's a couple of Johns. So it was anyone practicing witchcraft, whether male or female.
Yeah, that was just the feminist in me being like, oh,
yes, yeah. No, sorry to disappoint. I think there was majority women. There was just 2 men.
That's fair enough. And then obviously I've got to ask the ghosty question.
Yeah.
In those chambers where you can go and go to view tours, have any visitors reported?
Yeah,
anything?
I will preempt that with yes. So Lancaster Castle itself is said to be one of the most haunted buildings, if not in the northwest, within the UK. So obviously it's been a prison for hundreds and hundreds of years. We absolutely know lots of people are dying in there. We absolutely know Lots of people have been tortured there. And as I said before, we know lots of people have been executed here as well. You'll talk to anyone that's worked here, particularly as a prison guard, of which I've talked to a few. They will absolutely swear by there are spirits within that building that they are petrified of. And these are people that are used to dealing with not the nicest people in society. And they will hear muttering down places where there's no one there. They will have things thrown across rooms. Prisoners will literally ask to be changed cells because there's something within that cell that's driving them mad that they can't tolerate. They'll hear screaming coming from rooms that are empty. So yeah, we definitely know that the castle itself is home to lots of other spiritual sort of beings that haven't want to leave. And particularly when it comes to orbs on pictures, there's hundreds of pictures. Now, if anyone is unaware, an orb on a picture sort of symbolises a spirit that's within that sort of frame at the time. And there's hundreds of pictures taken in the castle with these orbs just floating around in the background. And we actually had one lady on the tour when I was mentioning this. I said, does anyone know what orbs are? On pictures, she says no, but when I went and did the tour, at the end we took a picture with my mum, and there's an orb just to her shoulder, just above it. I'm like, well, yeah, that means that at that time when you took the picture, there was another spirit there trying to say hello.
Wow.
So yeah, so it's a fascinating place. Again, it's been around for literally over 1,000 years, so it's a very old building, home to lots of death and torture. So things definitely have not left.
It may be one of the Northwest's smaller cities, but if our trip to Lancaster has taught us anything, it's that a lot can happen in a small space. And Peter has even more stories on his tour, the links to which you can find below in the show notes. And if you do find yourself in Lancaster's castle, in that spot where so many people left this world, just remember that creeping feeling making your hair stand up might not be the wind. That's it for now, but you can also follow us on Instagram at Eerie Excursions. And to be sure you don't miss out on an excursion, subscribe to the YouTube channel below. For our last adventure of the year, we'll be heading to Oxford.
So the theory is that he, regretting what he did so badly, is coming back as the ghost, and he's trying to find the body of Lord Grandison by digging up holes and so on. But he never will find him because he's gone.
See you next time for another venture into the darkness.